Hello and welcome to the Writing Talk podcast. I'm your host, Mikey Campling, and today in this week's show we'll be having a quick trot through my news, then we'll be getting on to the main topic, which this week is settings and research. Following that, we'll have a bit of feedback from the audience in our listener feedback section, and then we'll round off with this week's Writer's Toolbox. Welcome to the Writing Talk podcast, a show that helps you to build your skills as we go on our writing journey together. Okay, well, what have I been doing since we last spoke only a week ago? Well, I'm afraid I'm still very much embroiled in the business of ebook formatting, although I'm finally starting to make some more progress. So more on that, I think, in another episode when I've really had a chance to distill what I've found out for you. I'm also getting to the point where I'm wondering if I've taken on too much, and this might be familiar to some of you, this feeling. I've got this podcast to prepare and produce, and last week it did take me the best part of a whole day to put together. I've been trying to vlog on YouTube at least once a week, and I'm afraid I'm failing miserably at that, so I've done about 3 and haven't done one for a while. I've been posting one of my books, which is called Breaking Ground, up on my website in weekly parts, and also putting it up on Wattpad as well in weekly episodes, which has been an interesting experience. And I've been writing week by week a new sci-fi serial with a working title of Conspiracy, and that serial's going up on Wattpad and on a website which I run with some other authors called thecollectivesci-fi.com. And that it all takes work, and this is all on top of writing, editing and publishing other books, such as my Darkling Stone books, and I'm started work on the next one in this sequence to follow on from Cheat Code, my sort of cyberpunk book. And all in all, it's a bit too much, really. So I'm sort of at the point of making lists and saying, look, what should go? So if you'd like this podcast to keep going, because obviously that's on the list as a major time hog at the moment, then please do share your favourite episodes around and subscribe yourself if you haven't already. I know absolutely everybody says this on every podcast I've ever listened to. People always say, please share, please subscribe. But at the moment, it is quite a critical point because it's quite hard for me to justify that effort when I'm putting in so much time. And, you know, I'm very grateful to the audience we do have, but obviously these things take a long time to build. I understand that. It's just, shall I keep going? So, you know, I think word of mouth recommendations are wonderful. So if we could get a few of those going out, that would really be great. It would make a massive difference to me. So, you know, if you do know people who might like it, then please share it around a bit and see if they like it too. Had a very nice mention on the Buddy Got show the other day, so give Buddy a shout out. I'll put a link to the show notes because he's doing a sort of quirky, rather very individual style podcast, which you might enjoy. I enjoyed it. It was a nice listen. That's quite early days for that, but I'll put a link in the show notes so you can check that out. So anyway, I would very much appreciate any shares and so on and subscriptions that you can find time for. Thank you very much. Well, and now we'll just sort of seamlessly leap forward onto this week's main topic, which is all about setting the scene and the role that research might play. The other day on a radio show, I heard some famous writers being interviewed about the extreme measures they go to when they're doing research for their work. And these included things like wearing reproduction clothes and shoes that were based on the materials and the designs that were used hundreds of years ago. And one person had even moved to another country for quite an extended period. And there was other sort of similarly quite extreme and I thought quite bizarre measures that they'd taken. And I had the quite uncomfortable feeling listening to it that here were some writers who were kind of wearing their research like a badge for all to see. And I couldn't help but wonder whether I would really actually enjoy the work that they produced as a result. Now, there might be some genres when this level of detail is not only appreciated by the audience, but even really quite expected. And yes, historical literary buffs, I'm looking at you guys. On the whole, I hate to see research muscling in on the action in a story, though. I really feel that in any piece, whatever genre it is, that the focus of the piece should always be the telling of the story. And I don't like it when I see writers kind of wearing their research on their sleeves. I know I've said this sort of thing before, but I really believe that it's our job as writers to disappear into the background as much as we possibly can. I mean, even in historical fiction, I mean, I think just taking that case in point, I mean, it's a good idea to remember that if everyone wore sort of rough material in the period you're writing about, then they wouldn't know any different and they wouldn't necessarily notice or remark upon it. I mean, you know, when I put on a pair of jeans in the morning, I don't notice the texture of the denim. I don't comment on the stitching of the seams. You know, it would just be bizarre, wouldn't it? And so just because a story's set in the past, I don't think we necessarily want to hear all about somebody's coarse linen shirt or his heavy worsted trousers. That's how you pronounce it, by the way, for any of my transatlantic friends who might be calling it worsted. It's worsted. Anyway, so, you know, those things, I'm sure you know exactly what I mean. Sometimes they have a place, those details. So what am I saying? Am I saying that the details aren't important? No, not at all. I just think that when you're using details like this, you should use them from your research. You should use your findings like salt and pepper. You know, a little adds a lot of flavour, but too much ruins any dish. And even if your readers are the kind of audience who really enjoy seeing lots of sort of minutiae, little details, they should be much more interested in finding out what your characters are saying and doing. And I've written plots that are set in the modern day, in 1920, in 1939, and the Neolithic period, and even in the future, sometimes the near future and sometimes the further future. And I've checked out details beforehand, of course I have, but I hope I haven't gone overboard in pointing them out. I mean, I like to know details because it helps me to write confidently when I think there's like a basis of truth in the scene that that is playing out in the story. And I do feel I owe it to my readers not to spout a lot of nonsense, stuff that couldn't possibly have happened or couldn't possibly be. But any kind of over-description I really steer away from, and I cut it out when I can. Because when you're reading it, something like that, I feel it takes you out the flow. Any kind of overly emphasised description, it takes you out of the story, out of the moment, and you lose that sort of sense of engagement for a moment. And imagine you're in a cinema, you're engrossed in a film, and in the middle of the robbery, you know, the big heist scene, the person next to you nudges you in the ribs and says, "Look, that bank robber's suit is made from pure new lamb's wool with a polyester lining." You know, you'd go mad, wouldn't you? It's not relevant. I don't want to know about it. I get very tired of hearing what people are wearing in books. It's hardly ever relevant, really. The other thing, I'm afraid, and I'm one of these guys, but one of these people, so science fiction writers are terrible at this. I mean, it sometimes feels like a character can't go through a door without us having to hear how the damn thing works. I mean, if you're writing in a modern day setting, would you describe the workings of the doorknob? I mean, of course you wouldn't. It's just too mundane, it's boring, no one's interested in it at all. But to the passengers aboard your futuristic spaceship or whatever it is, then the doors would be just as mundane. They'd just be doors to them. They wouldn't be thinking about how they worked. And so it's hard to sort of shoehorn that detail in. And I know it's a shame if you spend hours working out how the doors work. And technology does play a part in it, in sci-fi, and the audience do enjoy a certain amount of it. But it can really, really clutter things up and get in the way. It just gets in the way of a good story. So when do you put these things in, these nuggets that you've dreamt up? Well, I'd say put them in when the details of your research could become important to your characters, and really then and only then. So if your character is picking a lock, then yes, the type of the lock and the method they're using to pick it is important. You know, I've written about that myself, and I think I had to go and check out those details. And it really is quite frightening. If you want to feel unsafe, just go online and look at how quickly people can pick locks of various kinds. You know, sort of 30 seconds people seem to be able to get in most house doors. That's rather an aside. Or, you know, just if your character is about to go to an important job interview or something, then the choosing of the clothes that they wear becomes an important detail, and it's part of the texture of the scene, and it should be included. But at other times, who really cares what someone's wearing? You know, who really cares how the doorknob works? And part of the reason this is not needed in the the settings that we're describing is that we have a shared understanding with our readers that the places we describe are fictional or fictionalised. I think most great writers have taken liberties with real places, and you shouldn't worry about doing the same. I mean, I think any writer you admire, if you look at some of the things they've said, you'll find that they're quite happy to move streets, move buildings, move towns, invent streets in otherwise realistic towns and so on. It's just part and parcel of reading a novel, I think. Again, background preparation is needed. I'm not saying that it isn't. And that's because I think it gives you confidence. And that confidence will give your writing a sureness of touch that you might otherwise lack. With decent preparation, it'll stop you from getting muddled when you're writing something, and it'll stop your style from wavering in that kind of indecisive way. But, that is part of your preparation. It doesn't necessarily make its way into your draft. For instance, I mean, if I could, just to use an analogy, if I could afford to have a jacket tailor-made, I wouldn't expect to see the tailor's chalk marks all over the finished jacket, and I certainly wouldn't really be interested in running my eyes over the pattern that he used before he cut the cloth, if you see what I mean. So we're looking at that whole different level of engagement. We're wanting the readers to engage with the finished product. We don't need to parade our preparation in front of them. All we really need to give our readers is just enough information for them to feel in the moment. Now, I know it sounds as though I'm sort of humming and hawing on either side of it, but like most aspects of writing, it really is, it's a delicate balancing act. But try and keep it in mind when you're writing and while you're doing your drafting, and I think your writing will improve as you go, and certainly in your editing as well. When it comes to choosing your settings, I'd say that's pretty much an intuitive business. It's a great idea to choose a setting that intrigues you. For instance, I visited the city of Exeter here in the UK countless times. It's sort of, a 20-minute drive away from us. So it's an interesting old city. But until a while ago, I didn't know that there were some underground tunnels running underneath the streets. That the tunnels are medieval, and they were built for a purely functional reason. They housed pipes that carried fresh drinking water into the city. So as you can imagine, from something that was functional hundreds of years old, the tunnels, they're dark, they're narrow, they're damp, they've got very low ceilings. And now it's a tourist attraction, and you can go along and, pay for your ticket and go on a guided tour. And so I did that, my wife and I did that, and it didn't take me long going through those tunnels before I realised that I just had to use it in a story. I just had to. It was just such an intriguing little place. And it was wonderful. These sort of neglected and sort of off the beaten track places that people pass by all the time without really knowing they're there. They just really appeal to me. So in my second Darkening Stone novel, Outcast, which you can read all about when it comes out early June, so a couple of weeks away really, probably from hitting the shelves, the virtual shelves, you'll be able to find what I made of the Exeter passages, as they're called. And I certainly took some liberties with the place. I changed the layout of them. I invented a whole new section, but it was inspired by what I'd seen. Now, in that case, that personal visit, it was really invaluable. It really helped me to get a feel for the place, but it isn't always necessary to really set foot on a place that you're writing about, especially when you can get so much information online. So in the third Darkening Stone novel, which I'm currently editing, finished sort of the first draft and first edit of, I set some action in a museum in France, and I've based it on a real museum for some kind of feeling of authenticity, but I've never visited it, never been to the place. I've trawled through their website just enough to get the details I needed to sort of inspire me, and the rest I've invented. I mean, I've just used common sense, I've used my intuition. For instance, it seems reasonable to me that a museum would have a lab for conservation work. It would have storage rooms where they would keep their artefacts, and even a staff room where the employees could have a cup of coffee. These things make sense, and I think it's fine to put them in, whether they're really there or not, and where they are in the layout. I don't think it really matters. How can I get away with this total fabrication? Well, when my readers engage with that scene, I'm hoping that they will recreate the museum that I've imagined in their own minds. and they'll use their own experiences for that. It doesn't matter that it will differ from my imagining of it. It's just so long as it feels real to them. So to the reader, some of them might think of the museum as a place similar to somewhere where they perhaps went on a school trip when they were younger, or it might remind them of a documentary they've seen on TV, or somewhere they've been more recently. I don't think it really matters. The sky's the limit. Who knows what readers imagine when they see a scene like that? So I think it's important because people enjoy creating those scenes in their minds, and remember, they do enjoy it. It's why they read. They want to feed their imagination. Don't do too much work for them. They really won't thank you for it. I think Stephen King says something similar in his book on writing as well, and I just totally agree with that. I mean, it comes across as heavy-handed. It feels as if you're trying to sort of micromanage the experience for the reader. It's a bit like as if you're almost trying to reach out from the page and sort of grab them by the throat and say, no, it was like this. We certainly don't want that. So by all means, do as much research as you need in order to write with confidence. But when it comes to drafting, whatever you do, don't show off your newfound knowledge. I know it's very tempting, but try to steer away from that. And when you're editing, look for opportunities where you can cut down on over-description or maybe tone down the level of detail a notch. And just remember that the real story exists in the space in between the words you've written. Okay, on with the listener feedback section of the show. And last week I asked you to share your tips on how you organise the mountain of work that seems to get generated when you're writing a novel. And we had quite a few nice responses. So we'll just run through the basics of a few of them. Full details will be on the site at writingtalkpodcast.com along with any links. So Lee Bales did quite a full description of what he does. And it comes down to using a very structured organisational level of folders and keeping his old drafts in a folder labelled _old. And if you don't know this, if you use the underscore character in the first character of a file name or a folder name, then when you sort your folders by name, it will come out at the top. And I use that. It's quite a good trick. So he keeps the working version, the draft is actually working on, perhaps in the sort of top level folder, and then the others are all shunted away into an old folder, and that's not a bad idea. And using like version numbers, which is a good idea as well, if you don't want to use the dates. I really like that idea of separating out things. I do something similar with versions of a manuscript as it goes through the production process. So I would have like one labelled formatted books, another one labelled published books, for instance. And then you just know where those important documents are kept, and you can make sure you've got backup copies and everything. And Lee also gets an honourable mention for sharing a project tracking spreadsheet that he's made. And there's a link to that in the show notes, of course. I can't really give it out here. So check out that link. Kenneth Buff said that he just uses Scrivener and he keeps everything in the same folder. And that is certainly absolutely possible to do with Scrivener. My only sort of downside that I can come up with on that is that it's not so good at sharing things if you want to look at, say, notes across multiple devices. Whereas something like Evernote scores highly for that. But yeah, you can put everything for a whole project in Scrivener. That's one of its great values, that you can do that. He does mention that with his paper notes, that it's not organised and ends up all over the place, and I can really relate to that. I mean, one of my favourite quotes is from Thomas Edison, I believe, who said that, so I have a place for everything and keep it somewhere else. This is not advice, merely custom. And I think I'm a bit like that myself, but that's all the more reason why I have to force myself to try and be strict when I can, because it's very frustrating if you end up wasting writing time, because you know you've written this nugget of wonderful prose somewhere and you can't find the right notebook or the right slip of paper. Another nice idea came from Tiffany Pitts, what a wonderful name, who said that she writes her daily sort of word sessions into a fresh document each day and then cuts and pastes what she needs into a main manuscript document, and then keeps a date in the file name and always in the same format. That's a good point, actually. You know, if you're going to use sort of day, month, year, or whatever, then stick to that, because otherwise when you sort by the file names, they'll come out all over the place. So thank you very much to everyone who's shared their tips. This week, I would like to hear from you, as we're talking about setting the scene and researching. I'd like to hear from you if you've done something strange or interesting in the name of research. So, for instance, for my book Outcast, I did go out and I sort of chewed up some dandelion leaves and clover leaves to kind of find out what they taste like. I won't explain why, because it would be a spoiler, and so that book is coming out soon. So if you've ever done anything interesting like that, then please leave your comments on this episode, which is episode 17, on the site, which is writingtalkpodcast.com, and Writing Talk Podcast is all one word. And who knows, you might get a mention in next week's show and a link from the show notes. Okay, for this week's Writer's Toolbox, it is not so much a resource that I'm sharing, it's more a exercise I'd like you to do. I like to set exercises sometimes. You can use them in any way you see fit, whether you do them or not, or how you do them is totally up to you. But if you'd like to take part in a more public way and help some other people out with your efforts, then post the results in your online space, wherever that is, and then post a link into the comments here on writingtalkpodcast.com on episode 17. So this week's task is to write a scene set in one of the following places that I'll list in a second, and really make that scene tick, but with only absolute minimal description. If you can, give a significant flavour of a place in a single sentence. For example, I was listening to an episode of something I've only just recently discovered called The Moth Hour, The Moth Radio Hour, I think is its full title, which is a largely American, I think, though I don't know enough yet to tell you. I think it's mainly set in America. And people come and give stories, which are always without notes, and there's all kinds of great speakers and some wonderful nuggets on there. So I recommend that. I'll put a link in the show notes. And a speaker said something more or less like this. He said, Seattle is a little bit different from New York. It's a city where no one is trying to accomplish anything. And the audience, did a great laugh. And I just loved that sentence. I mean, obviously I've never been to the States, never mind to Seattle, but perhaps we could all imagine somewhere like that, some sort of slightly sleepy place. It just works. As a description, it works. So, and similarly, something that always stuck in my mind is in The Restaurant at the End of the Universe by Douglas Adams. He described a car park by saying that, like all car parks sort of throughout history, it predominantly smelt of impatience. And I just really like that. That's the kind of thing that stays with you. Now, you might argue that's a little bit heavy-handed, but it was that kind of book. You could get away with it. But it's just the idea of sort of giving a succinct flavour in a sentence. So here are your places to experiment with. Do as many or as few as you wish. It's quite a fun exercise to try, and see if you can get a picture of that place with a single sentence if you can. So we have a dentist's waiting room, somewhere we've all been, I should think, a library, any kind of library you like, public or private, a graveyard, and a department store. They're all probably places you've been. And your readers would all have been there as well. I think that's important. So it's easy to get a shared imagining. And what single aspect of those places could you pick out that would give us a unique insight into that place and really give us a sense of place? So if you want to share your efforts, I'd absolutely love to see them. So you post them up wherever you post your stuff, and just put a link in the comments here. Okay, well, that's it for this week. So I really hope you found this episode useful. If you have, please do share the podcast around with your writer friends. Perhaps if you're in a writer group or anything like that, you could share a link there. Any word of mouth recommendations are absolutely wonderful, help to keep the podcast going. Also, please do consider subscribing. The show's on iTunes, it's on Stitcher, and it's on YouTube, and all those methods seem to be working really well now, so please subscribe there if you can. You can find all the details of ways of subscribing on the site at writingtalkpodcast.com. And there's also a subscribe by email, which each time there's a episode, it will send you an email with a link to the episode, which is very handy. Oh, you can also, of course, listen to it on Spreaker.com, and they have their own app as well. So thank you very much for listening and for all your support and comments and so on. So until next week, keep writing, keep tapping at the keys, keep scribbling, and above all, keep smiling. Goodbye.